Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar, What is the Big Idea Behind Inclusion? My name is Nicole Walsh, and I will be helping Jen Cole along with the presentation. Before we get started, I just wanted some housekeeping information for everyone. I wanted to let you know that Pave is a nonprofit organization that provides information, training, individual assistance, and resources. Pave is not a legal firm or a legal service agency, and as such, the information contained in this webinar is provided for the purpose of informing the viewer and should not be considered as a means of taking the place of legal advice that must be obtained through an attorney. So welcome, everyone. We're so excited. I just wanted to let you know some housekeeping information, such as that all participants have been muted, but if you do have a question, please feel free to fill out on the sidebar. You see on the right-hand side, you'll see a box that says questions. Click on that and you can send us the questions that you would like to be answered at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions. There's also a chat box if you'd like. Honor confidentiality, because this webinar is being recorded. We will produce a closed caption version later on during the week and post it on our website, so keep an eye out for that. But yes, honor confidentiality. These topics can trigger strong emotions, so please practice self-care and stick to the issues that do not identify individuals or professionals in the community. So make it a little bit more broad so that it can help the rest of the community and not just stick to one person. I would like to let you know about our speaker. Her name is Jen Cole. She's the Director of the Parent Training and Information and is also the 2015-2016 ARC of Snohomish County Parent Leader of the Year. Jen is a graduate of the University of Washington Leadership in Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities in the LEND program. She lives in the Northwest region of Washington with her husband, son, and 2 canine buddies. I want to present to you Jen. She can take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole. And I'm just pleased to be here with you today doing this webinar. This is our first parent training and information webinar. So welcome and thank you so much for participating. To begin with, I think I would love to launch a poll to kind of get a feel for where people are at in their knowledge of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So I'm going to launch the poll right now. And you should be seeing that. So my question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being expert and 1 as a beginner, please let us know what your knowledge about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is. So I see people are filling out the poll. All right, and so I'm going to close the poll and you should be able to see the results. Okay, so there are the results. So I see that there are individuals who are feel like they're beginners with this, but we also have some individuals that either fall in between or feel like, yeah, you know, I think I actually do know a lot about the idea. So that's great for us to know. Thank you for taking that poll. All right. So let's close that and let's start with our presentation. So a little bit about Pave. Pave stands for Partnerships for Action, Voices for Empowerment. We are a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1979. We provide support, assistance, training, information, and referrals for families and individuals with disabilities. And we really strive to be a one-stop shop for families. So often when families do reach out to Pave, they have multiple questions. It's usually not just one question. So we really work hard so we could provide information that families need. A little bit about our mission. Our current mission is a parent organization providing support, advocacy, training, and informational resources to empower families and individuals with disabilities. And I would just say that's a whole range of disabilities and even suspected disability. Our vision is that we would have an inclusive world that values diversity, culture, and each individual as a full and equal member of the community. A little bit about our programs. As you can see, we have a variety of programs. Some are specific to Pierce County, but we do have 2 programs that are statewide, and that includes Parent Training and Information and Family to Family Health Information Center. In Pierce County, we have Parent to Parent, Person-Centered Planning, Purpose, and in Kitsap, Jefferson, and Clallam counties, we have the FISPERT, the Family Youth System Partner Roundtables. We also have a program for specialized training of military parents. These are military families that have children with disabilities. We do specialized training on installations, not just in Washington State, but across the country and around the world. We also have the branch, which is the Military Parent Technical Assistance Center for other parent centers throughout the country. And a new program that we have coming online this fall is Lifespan Respite. If you'd like to learn more about our programs, you can visit our website at www.wapave.org. So some of the things that we do to help families, professionals, community partners, we provide a wide range of information and education opportunities. We have a regular e-newsletter that goes out. We are doing webinars and we will have them posted on our website. We do have translated materials into Spanish. We have bilingual staff that speak English and Spanish. We have our website, and we also have Facebook and Twitter accounts, which you can follow. And we are quite active on Facebook and Twitter, posting information for families all the time. All right, so more about our training today and what we are going to learn. We are going to take a deeper look at what inclusion is and what research says about it. We'll look at the benefits of inclusion. We'll see how inclusion is built into the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we'll learn the 6 important principles of the IDEA and how they may affect your inclusion efforts as a family member or as a parent. All right. So to begin with, what criteria must children with disabilities meet to be included in general education? Well, there is no criteria. Children with disabilities do not have to prove that they can be included. And this is a very important point for parents and family members to remember. And there are a lot of details to know about inclusion, so we're going to take a look at them right now. So what is inclusion? Well, we do have a dictionary definition: to take in or comprise as a whole or a group, to contain between or within. So that's the dictionary definition. But inclusion is much more than simply having a student in the space of a classroom. It's involving the student actively and having them as a full member of the classroom community. And if you are a parent, it's important to remember that your child does have a right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And really, with the IDEA, there is a strong preference for inclusion. Though inclusion is not explicitly stated in the Act, there is a strong preference for that. And it's apparent in the spirit and the intent of the law's least restrictive environment provisions. And maybe another thought would be that really effective inclusion can happen when necessary supports are provided in the general education classroom. So partial inclusion is also partial segregation, and that is not what the IDEA prefers, although the law does permit it when it's necessary. So the point is that special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the student cannot be supported satisfactorily in the regular classroom with the use of supplementary aids and services. So what is inclusion? You might look at this picture and you can definitely get a feel for perhaps what inclusion is not. Here you see the image of the door, it's closed. There might be a feeling of isolation, being scared, being alone. And really, when we think about making this happen for students, I like this quote from James Baldwin, in which he says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So inclusion efforts and work is work. It does take a lot, and it takes a team working together to make it happen for the student. So what is the alternative? So we have, as you can see on the screen, exclusion versus inclusion. We really want to be clear what inclusion is and what it feels like. And so in the exclusion model, we can see that not everybody is equal or valued the same. It takes the position that there are those who will learn and some who will not. It takes the position that only some are needed to contribute, and everyone will benefit from the knowledge and skills of a few. So that's one position. But the inclusion position takes the opposite spin on things, where everybody is unique and valued. Everybody can learn. Everyone does have a contribution to make. And everybody not only has a contribution, but they're afforded the opportunity to make a contribution. So also, maybe just a thought would be, in inclusive situation, everyone believes that all people have contributions to make. And so let's take this example of an elementary school, and where first graders might host a grandparents' luncheon twice a year. And in this model, perhaps not everybody has a grandparent to invite, but how can we make this even more inclusive? So maybe it's not just grandparents, but it's any family member or child might want to invite to be honored on that day. When you foster inclusion, you acknowledge that everyone has a responsibility and an opportunity to give every individual the chance to make a contribution. So that's everyone, not just a teacher, not just a therapist, not just you as a parent, but everyone. It takes a whole community to make this happen. So what's the alternative? I hope at this point you can see that the rationale for inclusion is really quite simple. And the alternative would be that image on the left side of the screen where the door is shut. Which pitch, as any parent, which picture do you want of your children in the photo album? Do you want them to be in your living room, or do you want them involved in a community? And for most families, they would say, yes, absolutely, I want my child to be involved and included in a community. And what does research tell us? So we're going to move into a second part of learning now, where we're going to look at myths and what the research tells us. So one myth might be that my child needs a special class to learn. Some families might feel that this is what their child needs. They need a special class, they need a segregated setting. And that is, a position that a family can take. But let's look at the research around that. In 2004, Pave did a study in which it was revealed that no studies conducted since the late 1970s have shown an academic advantage for students with intellectual and other developmental disabilities educated in separate settings. So that is a research fact that came up. All right, and so what's another myth? My child needs a self-contained class. She feels safe and comfortable there. Well, let's take a look at what the research says. So research shows that just by being in a typical classroom, children with disabilities have better self-esteem just by being included. I think this is because often students, when they're included, it feels empowering to them, and it addresses a basic human need for connectedness, exchange, and community. It addresses our natural curiosity about each other and the world around us. Of course, there is increased self-esteem when you're part of what's going on. Your presence is valued and valuable. This is just, this might be logical. And once again, every research study since the 1990s supports this position. So let's take a look at another myth. Having those kids with my typical child will keep them from learning. Well, let's flip the coin. So this could be a position where parents who do not have a child with a disability might be actually blocking inclusion or have real concerns about it that they're expressing. It could be, even the professionals who might feel this way. They might believe that having kids of all abilities keeps some children learning or will minimize learning opportunities for others. They might think that if the child is a grade level or even above grade level, they shouldn't be dragged down by children with disabilities. So you can kind of see the trend here. I'm going to show you some research that kind of addresses that very clearly. And yes, research absolutely shows that this myth is false. When you look at this research finding, performance is either as good or even better for typical kids when they are educated with children with disabilities. So imagine that they are learning as well as they would have, or possibly even better. Research has shown that this is to be true in elementary, middle, and high school. All across grades, typical kids do better when educated inclusively. So these benefits are also consistently demonstrated for students with disabilities. They do better when they're included too. Let's do a couple more myths and versus research. My typical child will surely learn bad behaviors from those kids. Well, let's take a look at that. There are those people who really feel that a lot of behaviors might be picked up from students who either struggle with particular behaviors, because children are learning from each other all the time. Well, surely all children learn behaviors from one another, but guess what the research says? Students without disabilities experienced increased self-esteem and an overall improvement of their self-concept when taught in an inclusive setting. So not only do students who disabilities have increased self-esteem. Students without disabilities experienced increased self-esteem as well. And so, you know, if you hear from, you know, an individual in the community with somebody with this concern, you know, you might have a response that could include that, you know, yes, that is a concern, but I'm wondering, you know, what supports and skills can be taught for that student to overcome those barriers, particularly when it comes to behavior. So yeah. All right, let's take a look at another one. The other parents just don't want my child in this class. Well, this is a tough one. And of course, you know by the trend now, I'm going to show you some research that indicates that inclusive environments do work. But facts and feelings are two different things. So and there are too many times when it just comes down to the feelings of certain individuals. And so let's see what the research says. Yes, so parents of children with and without disabilities felt that inclusion is beneficial socially and developmentally to all involved. All of the parents felt that the benefits of having a student with disability in their child's class far outweighed the negative. So, you know, I think that goes back to the kind of the idea about what inclusion is, where everybody is valued for their strengths and their contributions. And so when students without disability see this happening in their own classroom environment, where everybody's being honored for their skills, their strengths and their abilities, it makes everybody feel better. It makes it a place where social emotional learning can definitely happen, and students feel stronger and capable as they're learning together. All right, so right now we're going to look at some of the benefits of inclusion. And you know, we talked about the rationale. We talked about and the myths and the research. So let's take some time to look at the benefits and the outcomes in each of these areas. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that this is really interesting because all three areas connect and are related to one another. So they don't live in isolation of one another. They don't operate independently of each other. So there's membership, knowledge, and skills and relationships. All right. So membership is about your child being accepted. It's about how your child participates in groups. It's about belonging. Membership can be achieved many ways in school and preschool settings, like circle time and other interactive activities on the playground and through clubs or activities within the class and school. Here are some other examples. It could include reading groups in the class meetings, school assemblies, Cub Scouts, church activities, etc. And here are some benefits of inclusion. So reduced fear of human differences and increased comfort and awareness. Wow, so much more than just tolerance, but there's an acceptance of differences. Another benefit is growth in social cognition. It sounds fancy, but this is about being sensitive and aware in social situations. For example, this may be just naturally holding a door open for family members, friends, and a person in a wheelchair. And when we talk about being aware, we are talking about developing principles. Children taking moral stands, fighting back against bullying, fighting against discrimination, and standing up for what is right. Another benefit of inclusion is improvements in self-concept. So again, like the research shows, typical kids who are educated in inclusive settings feel better about themselves and have higher esteem too. Warm and caring friendships. Remember we talked about care when we talked about inclusion, and we talked about relationships. Well, kids that are educated in inclusive settings have deeper friendships and relationships. So, at this point, I don't know about all of you, but this sounds pretty worthwhile to me. And as a parent, I am a parent of a child with developmental disabilities. I want my child to not only be accepted, and I want more than um, people just tolerating him. I want people to value him and expect that he's going to make contributions, and knowing that his involvement makes the community a better place. All right. So let's look at relationships. And, here we are talking about friendships that children develop. Parents and teachers report many positive outcomes for children who participate in inclusive education. And this would include more diverse social networks. We kind of talked about this in membership too. And like I said before, you can see how this diagram is connected and overlaps with the other areas. And so, again, this is more than just tolerance. It's about acceptance, and it's about valuing that person as an individual. Another benefit is increased patience with and acceptance of people of all abilities. And this is just another benefit of inclusion. Patience, acceptance, I think, are very good things for all community members. Another benefit is increased willingness to help others and accept help from others when necessary. So there's always situations where, we extend help for people, but there are times we have to ask for help, and that should be okay too. And so let's take a look at the third outcome of inclusion. Knowledge and skills. So one of the most persistent myths about inclusion is that the presence of children with disabilities interferes with the academic achievement of typically developing children. And like I stated before, but I'll say it again, there's absolutely no data or research to support that position. In fact, the research shows that most practices used in inclusive educational settings benefit all students. And by using these practices, parents, teachers, and students themselves report many ways in which student academic achievement goes up. And this was recently, this position was recently stated by our Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Rigdal, in his address to special education directors in early August. He just really reiterated the fact that if we do improve outcomes for students with disabilities, we actually improve outcomes for all students. And it's a game-changing position where if we take the close the opportunity gaps for students with disabilities, we also not only help to close other opportunity gaps, but all students benefit from learning together and having access to supports that maybe are directed at students with disabilities, but others benefit as well. So, for example, accommodations and modifications made for students with disabilities in mind will benefit everybody. We all learn differently and at different rates. And when professionals are creative about ways to help individual students, student achievement goes up. So, very simple. Inclusive education settings also allow students the opportunity to participate in tutoring programs, either as tutors or the ones being tutored. And that reciprocal relationship not only benefits a student who might be struggling or might have learning differences, but it also benefits the other student as well, who has maybe strengths in that area that they're willing to share with others. And, the presence of therapists, for example, like physical therapists, learning specialists, they can actually help general education teachers individualize instruction. And, what one does to help one child can actually help many children. So, for example, in a childcare setting, a speech therapist who might come in to work with a particular child who might be nonverbal and is working to learn sign language to communicate will actually benefit other children who have that experience and exposure to that as well. It reinforces learning for all students. So at this point, you can see how all three of these benefits are connected together. Once a student with a disability is a member of an inclusive educational setting, relationships can form naturally with peers without disabilities. Accommodations or modifications made for students with disabilities may benefit their typically developing peers, like the sign language example I just mentioned. Most of all, students in inclusive settings gain knowledge about each other and share their skills with one another. So all students will benefit being together. All right, so before we move on to our next two sections that get into the idea, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, let's kind of just go over some real key points we've covered so far. So, children with special needs or disabilities have the right, and it is a right, to participate in the same neighborhood and community activities and programs that they would attend if they did not have a disability. As a nation, we call this equal opportunity. It's not always easy because there are always going to be people who do not agree with this, but it's a worthwhile principle for sure, and that's one worth fighting for. One that's worth finding those, it's worth finding those who do agree and having them involved in your efforts and in your life. There's lots of people who believe in equal opportunity for all individuals, and that should include students with disabilities. Children should have the supports they need to be successful and achieve their greatest potential. So if you recall the pictures at the beginning, if our students, our children, are not included, then they are by definition excluded. So as family members, parents, we might have to really brainstorm and be creative about those supports and what they might look like. But sometimes the non-traditional ideas are the best. Children bring their inherent gifts to their communities. You have to believe that your child is a gift to the world. Every child is, and believing in this helps a parent, a family member see inclusion in such a positive light. Children with special needs or disabilities must be afforded the dignity of risk. So this might be a new concept for some, and it's a big one. And it can be a really hard one for parents or family members, because truly no parent wants or family member wants to see his or her child fail. No family member wants to see his or her child being hurt or humiliated. And at the same time, we learn a lot from failing and getting hurt. Children with disabilities do not have to be sheltered and overly protected. They need to be allowed to experience risk and all the trouble and rewards that go along with that risk. And that's a really hard one. I think as a parent myself, I continue to kind of wrestle with that because, seeing your child work really hard or potentially failing the first time can be really hard on not only the parent, but for the child. And, but this is like one way that all children learn is by being given the opportunity. And the last one, communities should support our children's participation in all aspects of life. Surround yourself with a community that believes this and work to change the mind of others, because we know that many people and benefit from inclusion, and there are so many benefits for our community when all people are being included. All right, so what inclusion can mean, and that's a valued life. So all of the outcomes and principles we've discussed are good. I mean, right? Improvements around membership, like acceptance, being valued, better relationships, improved knowledge and skills. Who doesn't want this for themselves or their community, for their children? And when you put this all together, the fact is that inclusion can and it does work. There are ultimate and very good outcomes for you, your child, your community, the state, our country, the world, when all people are valued and included. And, maybe another thought to kind of connect to being included would be involved. Just because a person occupies a space doesn't mean that they're being included. They have to be involved. Inclusion leads to a life where people with disabilities are valued because their differences are respected and tolerance exists. Inclusion leads to a real circle of friends for individuals with disabilities, friends who are there because they want to be there, not because they are family or because they are paid. Inclusion also leads to the individuals with disabilities finding his or her own interests, hobbies, and even bigger and more important, their dreams. And because they have been raised in a challenging environment, individuals with disabilities who have been included flourish within these interests and dreams and can honestly and earnestly work towards their goals. Inclusion leads to a more independent life. This can mean independent housing, independent self-care, full and more robust choices. And inclusion can lead to far better and broader employment choice and opportunities. Okay, so we are a little bit halfway through this presentation. So let's talk a little bit more about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And educating children with disabilities was a principle and objective of Congress when they passed the idea. It is the primary federal law that protects the educational rights of students with disabilities. Federal legislation mandates that special education for all eligible children in the United States and territories. While the idea does not mandate inclusion per se, like I mentioned earlier, it's not specifically stated in the federal law itself, it does indicate a strong preference for these students' special education opportunities to take place along and with their peers without disabilities. The idea might sound simple in its purpose, but it's a big law that ensures students with disabilities can access public education and have accommodations and modifications to address their individual needs arising from the disability. So, I imagine that there are many of you who are on the webinar that does have a child with a individualized education program or an IEP, or maybe your child does have a 504 plan for accommodations to access their education. You know, the IDEA is an important educational law for families to understand. If you do not know the basics of the law, we as Pave and Parent Training and Information can provide workshops. We take phone calls when parents or family members or even professionals have questions about these things. And I just would note that before 1975, educational services to children with special needs were not protected by federal law. So, you know, if your child had a disability, it was kind of like kind of a game of darts as to what kind of education your child would receive, if they would receive anything at all. And now we do have a law that protects students with disabilities. All right, so there are 4 parts of IDEA, and while we can't go into all of them in detail, we would like to just kind of go over them broadly and kind of show you how inclusion is supported in every section of this important piece of legislation. So Part A of IDEA includes the general provisions of the law, its purpose, and relevant definitions of the law. So earlier I gave you a summary of the purpose in the last slide. While this whole section quotes research that Congress considered when enacting this bill, it is very interesting to read if you ever have the chance or desire or even the time to take a look. Part B is the part of the law that addresses special education for children from 3 to 21 years of age. Part C of the IDEA is the part of the law that governs early intervention programs in all 50 states and territories. In our state, it's known as early intervention. Part D of the IDEA includes programs and activities such as training and personnel or staff development, research projects, and parent centers like Pave. It's important to note that the IDEA specifically requires that there's one parent training and information center in each state. The law says that parent centers are here to help parents and families learn about their child's disabilities, educational needs, how to communicate effectively with school personnel, how to participate in education decision-making, and about parental rights and the options you have to use those rights. So even in the law, parent training and information centers are part of it to improve outcomes. All right, so IDEA's first finding. Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or to contribute to society. So this might sound familiar to you, but maybe again, maybe it doesn't. If you would feel that, you might need to think about this, it's something to consider as accepting disability as a natural part of the human experience. So students with disabilities are not so much viewed as those who need to be fixed or changed, but it's part of the natural human condition. And students, when given appropriate supports, services, and education, can either learn strategies to kind of overcome some of their barriers, or they learn that there are ways that they can learn that is just as valuable as other students. And that's not all. So Congress's first finding in the IDEA continues with that improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. So if you recall earlier when we were looking at the difference between inclusion and exclusion, if you look at this wording here, this is the law. Equal opportunity, there's no exclusion here. Without equal opportunity, there can be no inclusion. Full participation definitely is a hallmark of inclusion. Independent living and self-sufficiency ties back to the part of inclusion we discussed about not relying on the skills, resources, or wealth of a few to learn or do for the rest of us. And how about outcomes? You know, we discussed outcomes around membership, relationships, and skills and knowledge. So my hope is that at this point, you can see that the idea supports inclusion. We understand inclusion requires equal opportunity to participate, to contribute to society, and to become self-sufficient. And we've, at this point, only looked at a small section of Part A. So imagine if we really had the time to like go deeper into the idea. Okay, so this is a little bit out of order because we're jumping from Part A of idea to Part C, but that's because I want just kind of just start from the beginning. Birth. Infants and toddlers with disabilities from birth to their 3rd birthday and their families are eligible for early intervention services under Part C of the idea. The early intervention system has a different name in different parts of the country. So like I mentioned earlier, in Washington, it's called early intervention, but every state might have a different name for this. And, you know, early intervention services are defined in the IDEA statute as developmental services that, to the maximum extent appropriate, are provided in natural environments, including home and community settings in which children without disabilities participate. So that could be childcare settings, you know, natural environments where young children would be participating in their communities, and that could include the home. So now we are going to talk about the reason we want to make sure we start inclusion early in a child's life. Part C services are meant to ensure a healthy and proactive start for children with disabilities, and Part C talks about natural environments. Quite simply, ask yourself, where would my child be if he or she did not have disabilities? And what's the natural environment? Perhaps you're a stay-at-home parent, then home would be natural. If you're working, a childcare setting might be natural. Maybe it's a combination of both. I don't think any of us as parents would say that a hospital is necessarily natural or a therapy office is natural. A pediatrician's office might be more natural, but what about a park? Lots of other kids there, right? So what IDEA is laying out right from a child's birth is that even if your child needs something extra, he or she still has the right to be in his or her natural environment. And you, as the parent, the family member, have every right to expect that any services or supports needed are provided in that natural environment. All right, so let's jump back to Part B. And this is about students with disabilities from ages 3 to 21. And this is the heart of the education of your child. When your child transitions out of Part C, there is a big world waiting for your child and you. Lots of choices, lots of new experiences. Parents and families of children with disabilities really need to be proactive about their child's education. All children are entitled to be educated. For children with disabilities under IDEA, that education is guided by a plan that's known as the Individual Education Program, or IEP. This plan spells out exactly what special education services your child will receive and why. And just to be clear, notice I said special education services. Special education is a service, not a place. In Washington State, on the procedural safeguards, I believe there's a statement that says exactly that, that special education is a service and not a place. In fact, IDEA states that all students with disabilities need to be provided access to the general education curriculum. The IEP should focus on extra supports needed for your child to be learning at the same curriculum as everyone else. But what about if your child can't keep pace? That's all addressed in the IEP, individualized for your child. But again, all students should have access to the general education curriculum. The IEP can outline appropriate modifications and accommodations that can make this happen and make it happen in a general education setting. So, well, Part B curriculum, those would be the grade level standards. So public school systems establish the general curriculum or standards for each grade level, and the expectation that your child should meet these standards or learn the information contained in each standard, so that your child, if you have a child in the 3rd grade, for example, then the law requires that your child have access to his or her grade level standards. So in Washington State, we have K-12 learning standards. You can look that up on the website for the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And, so just to kind of pause here, if you're like myself, I'm an older parent, and I know that just looking at the standards, education has changed a lot since I went to school. There's a lot that students are expected to learn, and they're expected to learn at younger and younger ages. So for example, there is a standard in the area of social studies for 3rd grade students, specifically in the area of history, that says that the student will understand and apply knowledge of historical thinking, eras, turning points, major ideas, individuals, and themes in local, Washington State, tribal, United States, and world history in order to evaluate how history shapes the present and the future. So that's a lot, and that's a lot for a 3rd grader. And if you have a child who is below grade level, who might have some challenges around comprehending big concepts such as that, you might be wondering, well, why would I have my child included? What would be the opportunities for my child? And so it's important to know that that's what the regular curriculum teaches, but your team is the team, your IEP team is the team that comes up with figuring out how your child can meaningfully participate in that curriculum to make progress, because all students can learn. And we would not want to deny them the opportunity or deny them the dignity of risk to learn these concepts in ways that are meaningful for that student. So if you as a parent have a question, you can look up the standards on the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction's website. All right, so there is then Part D of the idea, national activities to improve the education of children with disabilities. As a parent, you might not know much about Part D, and like I alluded to before, parent training and information centers are part of Part D. It's part of those systematic programs that are targeted at improving outcomes for students with disabilities. And Part D programs have an important role to play because they've contributed to making educators better, to help all students, especially around professional development. And these programs are really important because They also contribute to a body of knowledge around what are evidence-based practices or best practices in education. So that could include like early childhood education, focusing on getting students ready to be in school with their same age peers. It can include academic instruction. It can also include behavioral and social skills. So students can make and have friends, gain employment, and live independently. It can also include, like I said before, teacher training, so that teachers get access to professional development they need to improve their practices to include all students. And yes, so Part D is also very important, but kind of the lesser known part of the idea for families. All right, so 6 important principles of IDEA. And there are 6 general themes outlined here on the slide that weave in and out of both Part B and Part C of IDEA, although they may be called different things in each part of the law. So we'll quickly take a look at each of these because, you know, showing you that the idea is your legal springboard to your child's education inclusive settings is not only helpful for you as a parent, but also helpful for more families to understand that as they're working for change in their communities. All right, so all means all. Schools have to educate children no matter the severity or nature of the disability. This obligation is clearly stated in IDEA as the state's obligation to identify all children with disabilities. The law requires that schools make a free, appropriate public education available to all children with disabilities, no matter how severe. And a child may not be excluded because of inappropriate behavior caused by a disability. And a child may not be removed or excluded because of a contagious disease, for example, unless there's a high risk that that student potentially can infect others. So yeah, it's an important principle to know. And how does this affect, you know, a family member or a parent's efforts for inclusion? It's just important to remember that your child does have a right to his or her education and to be in school. It's an entitlement for all children, actually. All right, number 2, non-discriminatory identification and evaluation. This is the principle that schools and early intervention programs must evaluate each child and student fairly and without bias to determine if he or she has a disability, and if so, how that disability affects education. So you do need evaluations to not only determine eligibility for special education, but also to identify that child's strengths and needs, and also to review that child's progress based on state standards. So the evaluation must focus on how your child's disability affects his or her ability to be involved and to progress in the general education curriculum. And remember, in Part C, for the little ones, that's the natural environment. Free and appropriate public education, otherwise known as FAPE. FAPE is very much the cornerstone of addressing the educational needs of children and students with disabilities. Its definition and idea begins by saying that FAPE means special education and related services that are, and then the definition gives 4 necessary features. 1, that it's publicly funded, meaning at no cost to families, just like any other school-age child. 2, it meets the standards of the state education agency, or in our state, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. 3, includes an education at elementary, middle, or secondary school. And 4, it's provided in keeping with the child's IEP, individualized education program, which is designed and tailored for that particular student. So FAPE is saying that a child's education should be tailored to that child, that it provides access to the general curriculum, and it meets state standards. The fourth bullet on the slide says that FAPE also means that the child benefits educationally. That's not included in the IDEA's definition of FAPE, but it certainly has been included in recent guidance from the US Department of Education. And there are those who know, like in 2017, in the Andrew F. case, the Supreme Court actually determined to, quote, to meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP, individualized education program, that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in the light of the child's circumstances. The court additionally emphasized that the requirement that, every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives, unquote. And the Andrew F. decision is important because it informs our efforts to improve academic outcomes for students with disabilities. All right, so number 4, least restrictive environment. You'll hear least restrictive environment often referred to as LRE. So in basic terms, LRE refers to the setting or place where a child with a disability can receive an appropriate education designed to meet his or her educational needs alongside peers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So the standard or expectation is that education with non-disabled children is absolutely the first environment to be considered when an IEP team is determining where a specific child with disabilities will receive his or her special education and related services. According to the Department of Education, which wrote the regulations for IDEA, quote, IDEA presumes that the first placement option considered for each child with a disability is the regular classroom in the school that the child would attend, if not disabled, with appropriate supplementary aids and services to facilitate such placement, unquote. So requirements like those I just mentioned mean that your child's IEP team, which if you are a parent or family member you are part of, first must determine whether your child can be educated satisfactorily in the regular education environment with appropriate supplementary aids and services before the team can consider more restrictive placement options, such as a separated classroom. And if the team determines that your child can receive an appropriate education in the regular classroom with or without supplementary aids and services, then placement in the regular classroom is the LRE for your child. So, every state does come up with its own process of looking at placement during the IEP process. So in Washington State, when the team is considering an appropriate placement for the student, they must take into account 4 factors. 1 being the content of that student's IEP, 2, the LRE requirements, least restrictive environment requirements, 3, the likelihood that the placement option will provide a reasonably high probability of assisting your student or the student to attain his or her annual goals, and lastly, the consideration of any potentially harmful effects that the placement option might have on your student or on the quality of services that your student needs. So if you have more questions about LRE, you can definitely give us a call, but this is also on the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction's website under Special Education. All right, number 5, due process safeguards. So safeguards refers to the principle that students with disabilities and their parents have the right to be informed of changes to their educational plan or program. And they have the right to participate in the decision-making process surrounding the design and updating of those plans or programs, and to also protest or disagree with any decisions they believe are adverse to their right to a free and appropriate public education. So many, if you do have a child with an IEP or IFSP, an individualized family service plan for the young ones, you have likely been given a copy of your safeguards, at least, once a year. You should have at least received a copy when your child was referred for services. So it's really important as a parent to take a look at those, because it does spell out what your options are. And of course, we at Pave are happy to talk with you at any time about what those options look like, and talk through what your options are. So yes, take a look at your procedural safeguards. They're there for a reason, and I believe that on the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction website, you can also get a copy there. All right, and lastly, shared decision making. This is the principle that parents and students have the right to participate in decisions about the student's education. So, like I said earlier, parents, you are a very, very important member of the IEP team. And there might be times that you might not feel like it, or even times that you don't want to be part of that team. But, remember, like in the beginning of the training, when we talked about the criterion for inclusion, yes, your child has a right to belong because they are who they are. And it's the first option that the IEP team must consider for your child. And you, as a parent, family member, you are an important member in the decision making. I think as a parent myself, I figured that by the time my son is done with um, public education, when he graduates from high school, he might have had 13, 14 different IEP teams, and the only consistent members of those teams will be myself and my husband. So it's definitely a journey, and you are a very important member of that team, because you carry knowledge of your child, you have a vision and high expectations for your child's learning, and you carry that on year after year. All right. And again, because we mentioned research earlier, research also shows that our kids, students with disabilities, do better when we as parents and family members are active and involved. And when you have a child with a disability, being prepared, present, and participating are very critical to your child's outcomes. Okay. So at this point, I would like to acknowledge that this inclusion curriculum was developed in partnership with other parent centers across the nation. And we as parent centers are divided into different regions. We are part of actually Region 6, and it was Region 3 that, Region 3 Parent Technical Assistance Center, that was the lead coordinator on this project. And here on the slide are listed other parent centers who took part in shaping what's in this curriculum, and we want to wish and express our deep appreciation for the sharing of their expertise and time. And another note is that while this resource was produced by the Center for Parent Information and Resources under the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, the views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. So there's no official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Ed for any product, commodity, or service that's mentioned within today's webinar. So we have time for some questions, and Nicole is going to help me with that.
Yes, we have a couple questions here. One is, what is LRE?
Okay, yes. So LRE is least restrictive environment. So teams, after they design the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, then the team discusses what environment would be the least restrictive environment for this child to access their learning and also have access to the general education curriculum.
Okay, I have another one.
Okay.
This one says, hi, my daughter was in pre-developmental preschool and was recommended, and I agree for her to attend self-contained classroom for her kinder year. I changed my mind 2 weeks ago, and now I want her to be in regular kindergarten school. I'm waiting for the principal from the kinder school to respond. Why am I waiting?
Well, that's a good question. So in Washington State, there might be schools that have not come back into session yet. There are some schools and districts where teachers have not reported back to work. And when we talk about placement for a student, it is a team decision. So that includes not only the family, but it includes the members of the IEP team. So that could be potentially one reason why that meeting hasn't taken place yet.
Okay. I have another question. How do I incorporate my son into a typical classroom when the school says no?
So when the school says no, so as a parent myself, if I make a request with the IEP team about something I feel is appropriate for my child in terms of their education, and they tell me no, then an option I have as a parent is just ask them to put that reason in writing. And there is a form which is called the prior written notice, and this is part of your procedural safeguards. The prior written notice is kind of like the thank you note that happens after a party. And when I say it that way, I mean that when a decision is made, an event has happened, then the prior written notice or like a thank you note kind of captures what happened and why it happened. And so that we as parents, when we make a request for our child, we can ask for it to be the decision to be put into writing and the justification for it. And then we can think about what our options are moving forward. And definitely Pave is one option you have to kind of call and to talk about the particular circumstances around your situation.
Okay. Going back to the same question about the child, that daughter that was going to kindergarten, it says, thank you. Will my daughter wait until they decide school starts on August 31st? Will she have to wait after school starts until we make a decision, or is it okay for her to start late?
Yeah, so again, what I would probably, an option that you have as a parent is to try to have this conversation before the bell rings for the first day of school. So typically, teachers do arrive to report to work several days before the session starts up. And usually the school office is open, and there are options for like scheduling a time for a meeting to talk about um, the concerns that you have as a parent before school starts.
Okay, so we have another one that says, I have a 3-year-old with severe autism. He has meltdowns and is nonverbal. How do I introduce him to his preschool to make it a successful experience?
Mhm. Yeah, so again, I think back to earlier in the presentation when we talked about not only the importance of inclusion, but there are challenges around that. And it really does take a team working together to work through that. So an option that a family has when they have a concern about getting their child integrated into school and having a successful start to the school year is to reach out to the teachers, because they are the ones who have actually quite a bit of knowledge about what can work, what can we try, and you as the parent also have a lot of knowledge about what does work for your child, what your child's strengths are. And so it's going to take a conversation, and working together to come up with the best options so everybody feels successful. And again, it kind of goes back to that dignity of risk that we mentioned earlier. It's sometimes it doesn't start off smoothly. It's hard. There's things to be figured out. But then we as parents have to think, well, do we try it? Because my child needs the opportunity. And how can I work together with the school to help make that happen?
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more questions on, let's give it a little bit more just to see if anybody else just comes in with another question.
Yeah, sure. And maybe as we're waiting, Nicole, I do have another poll for everyone because I know I covered quite a bit of information in our time together, but I could go ahead and launch the poll. All right, so here we go, as people are potentially thinking of some more questions. All right, so after participating in today's webinar on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being defined as that you've increased your knowledge of the idea immensely, greatly, and 1 would be that you did not increase your knowledge at all, go ahead and rate yourself. All right, looks like we're still collecting maybe a couple responses. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and give everyone a chance to take a look at the responses. All right, there you go. So my encouragement for families and parents is that really it's really hard to learn everything that a parent might think that they need to know in 90 minutes or less. And the things that we think we need to know can change. It can change with as our child gets older and new things come up. So it's an ongoing learning process. And what I want to encourage everyone is that, um, you know, Pave is here to help you on that journey, to talk about, issues that are concerning for you, to give you options and give you some potential ways to work through some of the challenges. And we also, celebrate that you are here today. Everybody who joined today's webinar and potentially those who might view this webinar at a later time, thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us. Because as one parent, like as a parent myself, I am always privileged to get calls from families because it always reminds me that I'm not alone as a parent on this journey. And I always appreciate parents who are working hard to increase their knowledge and to improve outcomes for their child in their communities. Because truly, what you do in your community benefits my child in the Northwest region of the state. So thank you for joining us today, and just be encouraged that it's a learning process, and it's really hard to feel like you'll know everything that you need to know in one shot. Usually questions come up later, and we're here for you. Okay, so how would you reach out to Pave to get some help? Well, I would like you to know that, at the conclusion of the webinar, you'll get an evaluation. And we appreciate feedback because as this is our first parent training and information webinar, we will continually strive to improve, to make things of high quality for families, so it's relevant for families, and then also very useful for you. That's the biggest thing. And then this webinar will be posted on our website. And if you would like to get help, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can call our 1-800 number, 1-800-572-7368, and then press 115. Or even better, you could go online to our website at www.wapave.org, and we have a online help request that you can submit, and that you will be that submission will go through, and a coordinator, a parent resource coordinator, will follow up with you and to help you access the information you need so you can make the best decisions that you can for your child. All right, so at this time, if there's no more questions, we might be closing our webinar just a couple minutes early. But again, I really want to thank you for taking the time to be part of our first webinar and to extend your learning about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and how that might apply to your child's situation. And then I also want to give a shout out to Nicole, our wonderful communication specialist here at Pave, who helped make this webinar happen today. All right, so if there's no more questions, Nicole, I think I'm going to close out. And again, just
Thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you. All right, have a good day. Thanks.